Welcome to all of you tonight, our students and faculties, and I've seen some of the alumni coming back for the lecture for this occasion, and for the outside guests coming to see the lecture tonight. My name is Elena Manferdini. I'm the graduate program chairs here at SCI-Arc, and I'm very pleased to be the one introducing Jing Liu tonight as our guest speaker. In academia, it's common to meet the person before the work, the speculation before reality, the abundant drawings and renderings that sometimes also replace the built work, and to learn about somebody from the polished images on Instagram much more than the work itself. Tonight, it will be actually an exception to these rules, or at least for me, because it's one of those rare occasions where I'm asked to introduce a lecturer whose work I met before the architect. I learned about Jing Liu and Florian Idenburg practice for the first time when I stumbled upon their art gallery in Seoul. I was in Korea for work, and a colleague of mine drew a map of all the must-see places in Seoul, and this was in the list. So when I arrived to the gallery, I did not know who you guys were, by the way, so I thought it was raw, interesting, cold, but not enough to prevent outstaging the art. It perfectly did what I usually think art should do when it's at its best. It negotiated the private and the public realm. I walked around the gallery, wondered how many of those rings they welded together and how they kept it so clean. That was one of the major questions. If there was a secret way between the walls and the mesh all around it, and how they managed to go in it to clean it up, all the leaves. But knowing very well that this was not an effortless project, and that for sure the weight of the mess of this mesh was very high and was difficult probably to tension on the box, I was wondering about its weight and its effortlessness and the beauty of the piece. And then I looked at the box over which this was stretched, and the box was not a box. It was much more than a concrete envelope. It was voluminous, had voluminous entries, gardens, oculi, and still was able to host large aluminum doors, air vents, and skylights. In short, I loved it. And the thought that a client would allow them to do that gave me a warm feeling that architecture is still burning. So Jing Liu tonight, our guest, co-founded Seoul with Florian Idenburg. I've been doing some research actually to understand what Seoul means. And I was not successful, but I stopped my research when I heard one of your lectures where Florian, joking, said that Seoul means so illegal. I thought, what a great. Alluding to the fact that both founders and all the employees are from somewhere else, they're all foreigners. This is a stage many of us, citizens of the world, are familiar with. It's a time frame of instability where one cannot look back. Your home is not anymore an option, you left. The new home is not quite fit yet, despite what your visa says on your passport. And I think they somehow really embodied this in their practice. Florian is a Dutch architect, Jing Liu is a native of China, and their projects are scattered everywhere. They founded Seoul, which I'm hoping that you will tell me what it means today, in 2008, during one of the most difficult economical crises, and at a time where many architects looked back at history to find some level of safe space to work, at a time where drawings exhibition became the new normal, or worse, became a perennial substitute for practice. Seoul decided not to look back and to practice practice. Along with the Kukje gallery in Seoul, sorry about my horrible Korean pronunciation, it's worth mentioning also the Manetti Shrem Museum, very close to us, at the University of California in Davis, that now is opened. When looking at the work, one understands clearly that it engages optical effects, novel use of materials, and builds upon, I think, Seijima's expertise to construct the effortless, and they made a step forward towards something new that they actually embody in their practice. The fundamental relationship between perception and matters is at the core of what they do. Scene placement and invisible hardware is their mastery, lightness, the economy is their strength. And as a consequence, their architecture has the ability to engage multiple possible readings of a stable form of architecture. I think the philosophical premise of the research they conduct hinges on the acceptance that there is an increasing erosion of the traditional metaphysical and rational fundamentals of modernism. And in the present society, because of the rapidly changing values, systems, political boundaries, we're witnessing a shift from the strong to the weak. And while this is indeed an expression of crisis that I think we all go through, the crisis of the dominant, the work of Jing and Florian takes on a positive view of the topic, arguing that such a shift actually enables multiple readings of the reality, and that really embodies latent architectural manifestations. A biographical note, Jing Liu received her education in China, Japan, United States. I think she got a master from Tulane University. She's now faculty member at Columbia and also at Parsons. Please join me in welcoming Jing Liu on stage.
Well, I think that introduction pretty much did all the job that I came here to do. Thank you so much. So I guess I would just say the same thing in maybe a less elegant way and tell a little bit of story of some of the projects. And came with actually until an hour ago, I wasn't sure which lecture I'm going to do. I came with two stories. One was about the making, and the other one was about living. And I decided in the last hour that I'm going to talk about the making, because probably a lot of you are not yet so familiar with our work. So I'm hoping that this just kind of telling you the stories of how we go through those seemingly effortless, but actually taking a lot of effort to do some of the things that we do. You will get to know a little bit of both the approach and the philosophy behind our work. But before I get into that, I want to do a little bit of advertisement of this book that took us 3 years to make. We indeed started the office with Florian and me, from different cultures, and now we are running the office with a third partner, Ilias and Papageorgiou. And so with 3 people, it's inevitable that we're getting to a lot of discussion. We actually have some of our formal staff here, and they can attest to that. That argument is, and the disagreement is part of our everyday life. So indeed, it took us about 3 years to make this book called Solid Objectives, or the Edge Aura. SOIL stands for Solid Objectives, Idenburg Liu, and you can say SOIL or SOIL. It's completely up to you. So this book kind of the title takes the solid objective, the first part of our name, that hints towards a certain projection and course that we, 10 years ago when we started our office, we set out to do. So in a way, it's a manifesto and birth cry in a way. We did not redraw anything in the book, so pretty much dumped everything that we did in the last 10 years and tried to make sense of it. So hopefully you have a copy here in the library, and if you have the time, maybe flip through it. I would love to hear your thoughts. Let's see. I put this image in as the start of today's talk because I thought I came to the school that, of course, is very well known for the digital literacy and has been in the leading edge of this kind of digital technological innovations in the field for a very long time. For us, we started our office in 2008 in also this height of the first generations of digital exploration has already gone and entered into a new phase in this development, and also in a moment where there was a financial crash and we are all confronted with this speed of information's consequences of that. So as the information and the communications are transmitted ever faster at the speed that's approaching the light, we decided to contemplate, instead of if we take this to the extreme in the sci-fi sense, what would happen, but contemplate on, at least for now, how does architecture, this incredibly still tactile and idiosyncratic space, shape the reality of that particular time and space. And if we look at the previous image versus this one, you can see that it's the same light, and there's some kind of emission coming out of the ground here, but it's the history and it's the geographic particularities and the irrational and sometimes trying to be rational development of our cultivation and habitation on Earth shapes these lights and the transmission into something messy and full of variables and hidden darkness in certain moments. And this is the territory of architecture, at least of today. And this landscape is also incredibly fragile and vulnerable. I think Frank Gehry said a couple years ago when, and he did give the middle finger in his lecture at the same time, that 98% of everything that's being built today is pure SHIT, and there's no sense of design, no respect for humanity or anything else. They are damn buildings, and that's it. And I think there's some truth in that. Transparency is not the truth that we are dealing with every day, and pure mathematics is not the truth, and extrapolation is not the truth. Every day we stare at the truth in front of us and can't believe that it is so. There's no formula to predict it. And as the introduction rightfully put it, that unsettled and anxious many architects turn to nostalgic, romantically reviving the fads of the past. Apparent simplicity and this early modernist idea of material democracy often become the default to practice in today's instabilities. So we, in kind of retrospective, looking at the work we've done and try to figure out what's the territory of our practice, and order edge aura in a way, in a broad stroke, outlining those three territories. And with edge, we try to see the plan beyond this operational manual as something that's less determined and more catalytic. And the plan becomes, in this way, an enabler, a device that calibrates relationships, a tool for the production of spatial events. And we try to incorporate elasticity and accommodate contingencies in, even in this case, Cartesian grid. This is because to date, the discipline has largely, and in a modernist sense, denied or attempted to escape these contingencies through a retreat to the notion of legibility or efficiency. So we believe that architecture needs to kind of try to incorporate the contingent presences and to revert this overtly reductive approach. The edge is, of course, it means a little bit of the encounter towards an architecture space that's definitively considered, and there's some intention to it. And we believe that the edge and the frame is very much at the core of the architecture practice. It's the moment where something, a spatial intention gets transformed. I think in the past, there's a lot of, at some point in art history, that artists have understood that the same piece of artwork can be seen quite differently, depends on what kind of framework it's put over it. I think a lot of the contemporary artists try to not have the frame at all, but in our projects, we try to consider that edge and contemplate that and make it into a productive territory of investigation. And it's a creative act for us, and this boundary that's delineated and allows us to incorporate multiple narratives and multiple versions of imaginations all at once someone encounters that space. And the third territory of investigation is aura. This is, of course, a much debated term when we were choosing if it's about aura, if it's about beauty, if it's about aesthetics, if it's about the character. We chose the word aura because it is, in a way, very unfamiliar terms in the architecture field, and it somehow embodies both an aesthetics and also the characters. Our first installation, which you saw before, of the pole dance, very much referred to Oskar Schlemmer's pole dance from the Bauhaus period. We believe that this abstract figurines and this kind of personalities that's embodied in his works, in a way, can be very productive in establishing interrelationships between abstraction and compression in the architecture space that we create. And objects and architecture who have personalities can help us to communicate and also embody political agencies that's very much important to communicate through these shared spaces. And as we increasingly occupy the available airs on this planet and share them, it's inevitable that we demand our volumes to not address only functional needs, but also narratives and fictions, so that we may inhabit a more joyful and characterful world. So with that introduction, I'm just going to show you 3 projects from some of the earlier projects. This is the Kukje gallery that was mentioned before. And you can see here that it's the first time that this character as a building emerged for us. And I hope that the story of making them would also show very much how people and the people who make it, the people who we argue with and eventually became the supporter of the project is very much part of the story. So this is a contemporary art gallery in Korea, and it's built in the site is in one of the most historical neighborhood in Seoul. It's literally across the street from the Imperial Palace. It's a contested area where a lot of these Hanuk buildings you can see around the site. They're all 1 story tall with masonry foundations and timber structure above. Occupy that entire neighborhood. It's very close-knit. Everything is very intimate. And then in the recent years, with this kind of global art market invasion into this neighborhood, there has been a big contested political background to add to the kind of foundation of this project. Our client was our art gallery. They wanted to make the biggest possible gallery box, functionally speaking, in this neighborhood. And we got a plan that was much bigger than this building because, in order to make a functional gallery, you still need all this auxiliary and accessory space, like the staircase and loading elevators and such, attached to it. So the first plan they got approved from the building department or planning department was much bigger. And we knew going into the neighborhood and kind of hearing a little bit of what's the contested discussion leading to the approval, how the neighbors felt about it. We took the plan and kind of shrunk it as much as possible and shrunk it to the footprint of the gallery space, which was this box, and let all the accessory elements to float around it and let them manifest themselves, this back of house and the supportive space, become almost like these mushrooms that grew on the outside of the gallery box. And we also thought that, here. So here you can see the black area were the space that we were able to expose outside of the gallery box, and then the gallery box was just a pure functional abstract white box. And still this was, although characterful, still had a harshness and a little bit of kind of awkwardness in the neighborhood. So we thought that how can we soften this even a little bit more, and created some of the tactility that this older buildings embodied as well, but not to rehash that and not to copy that, but to kind of approximate the same aura in a way. So in our first exploration, we wrapped the entire building with this stocking material, which was very elastic, and it created this double curvatures and balanced softened the concrete volumes through its sheen and elasticity. The client, of course, had been working with a lot of artists, so any ideas were not, crazy ideas were not very foreign to her. So she liked it immediately when she saw this model, and but didn't even ask what this stocking material was. So we had to figure out what this soft and seemingly kind of immaterial envelope was going to be. And that answer came out of a trip to the Metropolitan Museum with my kids. She was studying medieval period history, so we were looking at the armor there, and of course, this is not the one in the Metropolitan Museum. But we thought, well, this is kind of the similar thing we're trying to achieve, something that's very simple, but through the aggregation of a very small unit, through the interconnection, the way they're interconnected, that elasticity come out of it and can be achieved, but the material itself is still very strong and it can be viable for architecture. So we started to experiment. Of course, this doesn't exist in your spec book or off the shelf. So we started to investigate its possibility through working with engineers and material laboratories, looking at the tensile strengths and the breaking points of a welded stainless steel ring, and we mapped that all in the computer, simulated how the stress force would work over the entire building, and learned so much kind of hypothetically and through formulas and the mathematical principles that about this mesh. So it seems very real in a computer, but we didn't still believe in it, and we wanted to see how it really behaved. So we ordered from an Indian belly dancing supply companies this big metal stainless steel metal mesh. For a 1 to 10 model in our office, and immediately you see the wrinkles and the difficulty of draping in this model. But it was a very still comforting process. But we also realized that this is 1 to 10, so if you scale it up 10 times, inevitably there are many other installation complications that will come into play. But with this kind of things, we always try to solve the problems one step at a time. So first we figured out digitally what it was, conceptually what it would be, and then digitally how it would potentially perform. And then through 1 to 10 model, troubleshoot some of the, kind of surface some of the problems that might occur. And then that's the moment that we will go to the market, in a way, and go to the world and try to figure out who can actually go on such a crazy trip with us. And Alibaba at that time seemed to be, it was still a new thing. My father was a trader in the 80s, trading all kinds of stuff between China and Japan. And he lost his job in 2015 or 2005 precisely because of the kind of portal-to-portal business. So for me, it was a little bit of my father to be using Alibaba. But I saw the potential of it, and we went on Alibaba and saw that there are so many factories. It was just like, eager to show themselves and exhibit their skills. And we found that there's a town in China that had 2,000 something factories that all produced stainless steel materials, and mostly for oil refineries. So architecture is something completely unknown to them. And we started to chat with one of the companies, and then they were very eager and sent us this sample immediately, which again was a very big kind of step forward to this unknown territory for us. This was, I believe, about 3 meter by 1 meter, or 2 meter by 3 meter size, completely hand welded because the belly dancing equipment or the material for belly dancing is made by the machine, and they're all butt jointed. So to scale it up to the scale that we needed for the tensile strength, it needed to be hand welded. So at least looking at this, we thought, okay, this is possible. Then, we decided to go visit the people who would be making this for us. And we arrived at this village, and we realized that this is not really so-called the land for stainless steel mesh, but it's really a factory town without any social infrastructures, and it's 2,000, not factories, but workshops, because the factory that sent us the sample was in this kind of settings with trees coming out of the welding tables. And literally when we were arriving, we saw how they were welding our stainless steel, which is just having a bunch of rings in front of them and doing one at a time without even glasses, as you can see. So when I told the workshop owner, that we needed 500,000 rings to be delivered to Seoul in 8 months, he said, maybe you got 1 0 too many. This is not possible. We never, you have to weld it by hand. You know how difficult it is. And I said, I knew how difficult it is. That's why we were very excited to see the possibility of you doing it. Anyways, at the end of the day, after 12 hours of flight and convincing these guys that it's possible, he said, yeah, we have a lot of people in town that all can weld, and they're all my cousins, so we can get a bunch of people together. In China, cousin really stands for a lot of things. They can stand for your enemy, your neighbor, and your friends. So at the end of the day, we got a lot of cousins together and devised a whole kind of process of working in different remote locations, and each one with these panels on the plywood easel so that you can see what you're doing, not just a bunch of rings scattered in front of you. Because when it's quite a big piece, it's very easy to link them different. By mistake, not following the way they're supposed to link it together. And you can see your mistake if everything's bunched up. So we devised this whole process together with all the cousins. And then they can work simultaneously in different locations. And then once the small swatches are done, they can be stitched together. So it would be the way they're stitched together is the same way that each ring is welded next to each other. So you'd never see the seams. And we also rented the local car wash to then wash them and process the finish. And then once the medium swatches are done, they can be stitched together to these large pieces. And we rented the local schoolyard to do the mock-up as well, and had the school children to be our inspectors. And I think it passed them very well. And then when they got on site, at the same time, during that 8 months, the concrete was poured on site, and you can see the scale of this building being quite, comparable, a little bit bigger than the typical buildings around it. So at this moment, there's still this crudeness and the harshness to this character. In the middle of the winter, this chainmail mesh arrived. There are 16 swatches arrived on site because each of the swatch is so heavy that you cannot create even bigger one without a big crane. And this neighborhood is so tightly knit that we can only get a mobile crane into the site. So 16 of them gets pulled up to the top, and they are basically fixed at the bottom and then pulled up to the parapet, and then gets tensioned at the top with the springs. I like this picture very much because somehow the way although it's stainless steel, the handmadeness of the whole mesh resembled also this labor of making the tiled roofs in the neighborhood. There's some kind of similar rhythm in this conversation. So this initially very crude concrete boxes became much more malleable and elastic, and it took on a much softer characters as a result, and the light falls onto it without casting a very harsh shadows at the end of the day. And then this double curvature that you can never predict in the computer was achieved through the material character. And we were able to, through, this is a very private, it's a private gallery, although accessible to the public at any given moment, but still, as you can imagine, contemporary art is, a little bit of, still in people's mind, highbrow activities. So by kind of reversing and putting some of the supportive elements outside, we tried to give it a little bit more publicness in this program. This is a staircase going up to the roof, and this is a staircase that went down to the theater underground. This is the building seen from another building in the neighborhood. Because of the closely, very tight surroundings here, you can't really see this building as an object. I always find it similar feeling when I approach this building as an elephant, that you really kind of immediately find yourself at the bottom of a quite soft but big object when you're meandering in the neighborhood and suddenly appears in front of you and you're confronted with it with some element of surprise, but not all that threatening. So this project gave us a lot of, the PS1 project, we also made a very elastic structure that we told the MoMA that we wanted to make a structure that's on the verge of collapsing, and pulled that off. And then this project, we told our clients that we were going to deliver a 500,000 hand-welded ring in 8 months, and we pulled that off. So that gave us a lot of confidence in keep pushing for crazy things in the world. So this is a project that we have recently completed the exterior. It's a museum in Hong Kong that we also kind of took a little bit of risk in the making of the project. So the museum is on the tip of Kowloon, East Kowloon, so West Kowloon, that the M+ building and the Norman Foster master plan is happening on the just a little bit on the right side of this picture, and the East Kowloon is the tip where you see the CTF Museum and the dot. That's a kind of a more older and a developed area of Hong Kong that is being revamped at this moment, and our client is developed. Sorry, it keeps jumping, and it's a developer that basically are revamping that whole neighborhood with mixed use and new subway stations and a whole theater, and inside this mix of programs, and there's a museum that's inserted in there. And Hong Kong is one of this amazing place where you have this very brutal architecture, tropical kind of architecture, and that's set against this majestic tropical rainforest mountains, and in front of it is this intense urban life that's happening. So this layered and hybrid and everything in the face of the other activity is very much the context of this building. And our project is this museum that's inserted into a mixed-use building that at the bottom is 5 stories of shopping mall, and on top it's another 10 stories of residential building, and then next to a hotel and the office and an intercontinental hotel here. So this is a intensely hybrid, intensely urban, jumbled up environment. So the biggest question then, it's incredibly difficult questions at how do you insert something in there without it being engulfed by all the activities around itself, but also to, in a way, establish a dialogue with it without it just kind of being scared and shut itself away from what's happening around it. The museum is on these 2 floors. It's a double height space museum. And we had the privilege to redo the facade completely from the building facade. And so by inserting something that's very ephemeral and abstract, but it also spans this entire double floor, we thought that the museum can, in a way, blend itself in this very commercialized and basically the quotidian of the urban life, but it also creates a different scale to introduce a certain monumentalities that's soft and that's transparent in this context. So at a close glance, this is a 9-meter tall glass tubes, so they're glass columns that replace the Han curtain wall systems of the building, and it's loaded onto the deck of the podium. So they're all structural glass, and they span 9 meters of the entire height of the museum. Because of the diameter and the tight curvature of the glass, that we were hoping that it would create this both kind of revealing moment, but also hiding and discrete effect. This is earlier study models that approximated the effect that we're looking for. So from the outside approaching the museum, we're in another building across the street that you can somehow see the activities in there, but not completely revealing it. So this is and we also pushed all the amenities of the museum to the center plaza, which is on the 7th floor of the, or 6th floor of the building, so that this plaza is all publicly accessible. And on the plaza, you can see the view of Victoria Harbor, but also a glimpse of some of the programs inside the museum. So the cafe and one of the entry galleries is facing that public plaza. And one of the galleries has its view towards the Victoria Harbor as well. So all the galleries are slightly recessed or tucked in inside the perimeter of the museum, but giving the perimeter to more the publicly accessible areas. So in the beginning, we, of course, kept it open if we were able to achieve this 9-meter tall glass columns. We investigated many ways to bend the glass, extrude the glass, drop the glass, and they all had their own limitations. So sometimes you can only do half glass, sometimes the diameter is constrained. At the end of the day, we chose for tempered glass, annealed glass that's bent from a single sheet of a single flat sheet, and it takes about 8 hours to bend the glass into the tight curvatures that we were looking for. It's about 1 meter diameter, and the glass is 12 millimeters thick. So each of the tube is about 1 ton, weighs about 1 ton. Well, half of the tube is 1 ton, so the entire tube is about 2 ton. So it's incredibly monumental effort, and this is one of the first mock-ups that we did, and which again confirmed that sometimes crazy things can be done. And the tubes are, because they are completely, the full tubes, they're completely sealed. So we have to, the amount of air that's trapped into this, in a way, a very big IGU unit is a lot. And in the very tropical climate of Hong Kong, to keep that amount of air in a stable humidity level is very difficult. So there's a constant dry air that's pumped into the tube to keep the air at a constant humidity level. So it looks quite minimal, but there's a lot of work that goes into it for that to look so. This is in our glass fabricator's shop. What was amazing is that if you push the sides of glass to that level, there are very few people that can handle it because it's so heavy. And a lot of it is really computer processed. So from the moment that the flat sheet of glass is prepared to be sent into the oven, on this motorized and automated track, to sending it into the oven and putting it onto the mold, everything needs to be computer monitored. This glass, as you can imagine, that over the course of the 8 hours, it wants to do its own thing. It wants to slide, it wants to shift, it wants to bend. So it's an incredibly precise process. I think we had to, Kukje, our fabricator, had to create a new clean room and staging area for the production of this project, which was, for everyone, it was very exciting to kind of push the limit of what glass can do under heat. And here is some cleaning the glass. There are 475 of this glass being produced and shipped to Hong Kong from Spain on this container. This was only possible because our site is on the harbor, so we don't have to drive the container into the very tight streets in Hong Kong, and we were able to just deliver the container right at the harbor and pull it up. So this is the construction site a couple months ago, and now we just finished the exterior before the new year. So I'm very excited to see that in 1.5 years open to the public. I think the last project I'm going to talk about is also in California. It's this museum of Manetti Shrem Museum on the campus of UC Davis. This is one of the first kind of big competition that we won. The process of the competition was a design-build, which I believe is the first design-build museum that's ever done in America. And design-build is a process that typically is notorious for phasing out innovations, and there's so many other priorities in that process that make innovation and make design quite impossible. So maybe it's out of naiveness that we enter the competition, and it's maybe out of the naiveness that we seemed so confident and positive during the competition to be able to do this. It was $25 million project, completely set. UC system is very, very stringent and very, good at monitoring and making sure that 25 million is the max for the project. So the building itself is set on the edge of the campus. As you can see, it's next to the highway. It's almost next to the countryside or the agricultural landscape beyond. The building itself is only about 60% of the site that we were given. So within a design-build framework, we probably were very naive and stupid to propose the building would cover the entire site, because we thought that this was already at the edge of the campus, and if the building also recedes itself from the edge of the building, how can it extend towards the campus and draw people in? This is UC Davis is known for its agriculture program. So for a lot of the students, art is not something that they grew up with, and this is the first art museum on campus. There was a clear objective and ambition for the director to make sure that the museum is not only hosting the collection, but it's also a teaching museum. It's the way for the students to be exposed to the art while they're on campus. So this idea of the student center and the teaching tool, pedagogical tool, is very much an important part of the ambition of the project. I will touch on that a little bit later. So UC Davis is this 1 square mile, habitat inside this very regulated agricultural landscape in Northern California. And the landscape there, as you all know, is getting drier and drier and drier. It used to be, it is still a very productive land, but the land has been, cultivated and, feeding humanity for a very long time. So for us, this idea of engaging the environment, but also the kind of productive landscape in our new contemporary narrative, it was very important. So we took the motif of this agricultural landscape and this patchwork of a different productivity and drew that onto the site using some of the connections and the vistas that we wanted to maintain. And the plan became more of a kind of patchwork and a quilt of, I wouldn't say programs, but they were more activities that differentiated from each other, but also in a way had a relationship with each other. And literally, rather than drawing a typical plan, we inserted all the activities that was supposed to take place inside of the museum in this patchwork and of different portfolio of spaces. Some are more rectangular and some had a more curved space, and some are facing one way, some are facing the other ways. So the plan became something very exploratory and very open, and by doing that, we were able to also incorporate a lot of outdoor space into the building itself. Again, I think if we had a little bit more experience, probably it would be something that under the framework of design build, we wouldn't have dared to do, but we thought this was the right thing to do without thinking too much of it. So we proposed this grand canopy that covered the entire site, and the building itself kind of spread itself out under the canopy. And our partner of the construction company said already during the competition phase that it is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but let's give it a try. So we won the competition, and at that moment, the canopy was reduced to the simplest, beam, and I think the contractor even predicted that we would unbend all these curves that we drew in the first iterations and make them all straight beams. But we pushed to the other direction along the way. The canopy was supposed to just be beams and with joists and steel joists and infill of the cheapest metal mesh. We thought that it was very important to have the canopy to do the things that the tree canopies would do, have people to be connected more with the sunlight and also the harshness of the sunlight, but also this giving the sunlight as an energy-giving force, very much informative of the productive landscape in Northern California. And if you look at the tree canopies, there's this layered transparencies and movement in the tree canopies, and somehow under that canopy there's this animated presence of the nature kind of falling on you. So we wanted to very much recreate or simulate that experience. So rather than just a simple sheet of aluminum, perforated aluminum, we started to, against everyone's advice, especially the contractor's advice, just dream of different ways to make it more nuanced and make it more animated, through patterns and maybe three-dimensionality. And we ended up with a solution that both saved more money for the contractors and it achieved this more nuanced shadows that we were looking for, which was to get rid of the secondary beams and just use this perforated metal, this perforated metal sheets, but bent it into a triangular profile so that they become structures themselves and they can expand, they can span up to 30 feet because of this section. And by the variations of the densities and also the different directions of this piece, that we were able to create different kind of shadows underneath it. And because it's such a simple extrusion, or not extrusion, simple profile, that it was very easy to also cut it in different lengths and play with it in the, play with it with the rhino and simulate the shadow that it would create on site. And it was very easy also to be able to create mass-produced variations with the very well-controlled documentations. So we sent these drawings to the fabricators in China, and at the same time, similar to Kukje Gallery, that while this was produced, the concrete was poured. This is a prefab concrete, so not in situ, but we worked with a highway contractor to produce this very simple prefab panels that would be used as the exterior envelope for the interior space. And while this was constructed, the canopy piece was fabricated in China at the same time. the seismic of canifolia made the columns a little bit fatter than we had hoped. But I think our client actually liked the fatter columns because she was the importer of Italian fashion back in the days. So she said, column needs to have strength, it needs to be powerful. And somehow that was to her taste. So we were able to, from the savings of the infill piece, maintain all this double curved beams on site. And concurrently, this was fabricated, shipped, and because they were all numbered really precisely, we were able to install all the canopies within 2 weeks. And they're super lightweight, so a person can do that on the cherry picker. This is the effect that we were very much hoping for and achieved through this very simple solution. So this interaction between the patterns on the concrete and the canopy created even more variations on the walls. There's no one stable moment under the canopy or inside of the building, because the sun is constantly moving. You're always aware of the passing of the time here. I think that's it. I'm not going to go to the next.